founder of OptimaEd, Erika, and Florida Commissioner of Education, Anastasios Kamoutsas, join Mercedes Schlapp.
Ahora estamos con dos gran personas que son los líderes en la área de educación, que la educación sabemos es tan crítica en lo que es el crecimiento de la economía aquí en los Estados Unidos. So Erika Donalds, future First Lady of Florida, welcome. Statsy, thank you for joining us. He's our Florida Education Commissioner. How long have you had the job?
Technically, I started July 14th. So
wait, you're about to be the Education Commissioner. This is so exciting. We are honored to have both of you with us here. Erika, I'm going to start with you because you have such a fascinating background. First of all, you're the mother of these gorgeous 4 boys, right?
3.
3 boys.
Well, 4 if you count Byron.
Well, Byron, 4 boys. No, they're wonderful, wonderful, beautiful family. But then you decided you were going to get involved, and you ran for school board, you won, and this issue of education and parental choice really became something that you felt has been a critical issue for you to advocate for. Talk to us about that.
Well, it did start with my children. I, as Byron mentioned earlier, was in finance. I spent 20 years in the financial services industry, was just raising my family. We did what many middle-class families do. We bought a house in the neighborhood where we wanted our kids to go to school. This was the A school district. That's what we worked so hard for. But I found out that not all schools are the same for every child. My oldest did great, and my second child was absolutely miserable in school. Kindergarten, we made it through, but every day was crying, and he did not want to go to school. And by the time we got into the middle of first grade, I couldn't take it anymore. And I pulled him out and put him into a small classical Christian school, and I literally put the tuition on my credit card. I could not afford it at the time. But the first time I picked up my son from school in his new classical environment, he jumped in the car with the biggest smile on his face. And he was like, "Mom, did you know about the Crusades?" And he talked all the way home with so much joy about what he had learned that day. He was a different kid from then on. And I immediately thought, how many other Darrens are out there? How many other moms listened to the experts who told me that he should be on medication? And I didn't listen to them. And thankfully, he just graduated from high school. He's going to play college basketball. He's never been in a special classroom or on medication, but he was able to thrive in a school choice environment. So that motivated me to run for school board, to open charter schools, and to work on education policy for the past 15 years now, with a lot of great successes, thanks to Stasi and the things he's done behind the scenes for many years. Even though he's not commissioner yet, he's been in the department and around education in Florida and a huge influence for a long time.
Stasi, you've been kind of, the behind-the-scenes guy, deputy chief of staff, done so much work in this area. What are the challenges you all have faced at the state level when it came to ensuring that the children were receiving the best education they had, and the parents, you would have the rights to basically ensure that their kids would get the best education?
Well, thank you for that. And, at the time I was in the general counsel's office when our biggest challenge was COVID. I thought it was going to be a lawsuit expanding the scholarship programs because the teachers union knew they were not going to be able to defend Bush v. Holmes. And so I was brought up by Richard Corcoran because I was an aggressive attorney down in Miami, and we knew we wanted to expand the scholarship vouchers. That lawsuit never came because Governor DeSantis remade the Supreme Court, and they knew they didn't have a shot to win. So it ended up being COVID. And during that time, we saw, and many parents saw, what was happening in their schools. And we had to fight to keep schools open. People forget the teachers union tried to keep our schools closed. And it was amazing if you see the narratives that were out there, that we were going after minority students, students with disabilities, English language learners. But let's take a step back. Look at the testimony in that trial at the injunction hearing. We had the head of the Urban League, Glenn Gilzine, talk about how important schools were for his community in particular. whether it was to get a meal, whether it was for safety, to receive an education. It was a big deal. English language learners had a very difficult time with remote learning, for Spanish-speaking parents in particular who were having troubleshooting their technology issues. And then you talk about students with disabilities. We had 2 parents who testified. One of them was a mother with a child that had autism who said, "You cannot put a computer screen in front of my child's face or they'll whack it out of my hands. It just will not work." And so you had to have the courage and the conviction. Governor DeSantis definitely led with that. He knew the medical science that supported him. If you look at that trial, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who was now recruited by Donald Trump, was our leading scientific expert who testified that what Governor DeSantis was doing by keeping schools open was the right decision scientifically. And so that was just one of many battles that we've fought in education. And it really has shaped the landscape for education in Florida. And that's why we have all these accolades. We're #1 overall in education by not Fox News, by U.S. News and World Report, which is a left-leaning ranking system. #1, 9 years straight in higher education. #1 by the Heritage Foundation. #1 by the Parent Power Index. #1 by the Center for Education Reform. Ranking after ranking after ranking, Florida has delivered because of the leadership of Governor DeSantis.
Now, as a former school board member, you've seen some of these school boards really go radical, like indoctrination. They shut the parents down. I live in an area in Virginia near an area called Loudoun County, which was ground zero when it came to allowing biological males into girls' bathrooms. This being a big issue that impacted the election because the American people said, we don't want this indoctrination. We don't want boys in girls' locker rooms. And this fight has really, I think for so many parents who never got involved politically, Erika, they jumped into the political fight because they're like, no, we don't want the boys competing in the girls' sports. We don't need Jimmy competing against Sally for a scholarship. How did it get so out of control? Do you think we're turning the tide here?
Well, I think people need to understand that it has been out of control quietly behind the scenes for a very long time. See, I was on the school board in 2014, and these things were happening then. The indoctrination was happening then. The Obama administration had put out a Dear Colleague letter saying that we had to allow students to use the bathrooms that were their gender identity. And school districts just adopted those policies very quietly when no one was paying attention. I was in the minority on our school board. We tried to say no, and they overrode, the 2 votes that we had. So it's not a new phenomenon what is happening. What's new is that the silver lining of COVID, that the curtain was pulled back and parents got to see exactly what was going on, what their children were being taught or not being taught. Parents were very disappointed with the lack of rigor that they were seeing during COVID, but the indoctrination that was happening, whether it's LGBTQ or CRT, those types of things were exposed. That's when you saw the groups like Moms for Liberty come out. You saw Governor DeSantis leading the charge against these things from a legislative perspective. And now it's exposed how out of control it is even more because of how much they're fighting to keep those things in the schools. But thank God for the parents and the community members that are running for school board, that are going to school board meetings, that are holding these people accountable because it's working. And for Donald Trump as well, and the executive orders that he has put forth, in addition to what DeSantis has done here in Florida, although they continue to hold on to that, we're winning the battle, not just from a legislative perspective, from a legal perspective, but the country writ large. You have 89% of Americans, not Republicans, not conservatives, but Americans that say that boys do not belong in women's sports. So we're winning the population and the opinions of our fellow Americans. Also, we're winning thanks to Governor DeSantis and President Trump's leadership.
I have to ask you about this recent, actually just yesterday, the Supreme Court ruling in favor of parents. Walk us through why that decision is so important in this fight for parental rights.
Because that decision and the executive orders that President Trump has recently issued are taking the Florida model to the nation. What they decided yesterday was a bill that was passed back 3 years ago, House Bill 1467, that in Florida, thanks to Governor DeSantis, he signed a legislation that allowed parents to object to books that are inappropriate. Well, that wasn't...
Explain the books. Like, this is what you go crazy. You're going, how is this possible happening in the schools?
These books are so inappropriate that just a month ago, we had the superintendent of the Hillsborough County Public Schools come to a State Board of Education meeting and explain these materials and how they ended up in his classroom. At that meeting, if you go to Florida's Voice, you'll see Ryan Petty, the school board member, asked that superintendent, can you read these excerpts from the book? And he said, I'm not going to do that. I don't feel comfortable doing that. Well, if you don't feel comfortable reading those books in a public setting like a school board meeting or a State Board of Education meeting, how could you think that those books are appropriate for our minors? Governor DeSantis has led the charge, and it is absolutely biblically driven. We have to protect the innocence of our children.
Amen.
And this is something that we are fighting on the front lines. It started with COVID as our big education fight, but we've seen it. We are fighting a battle of good versus evil. We are fighting for truth. The fact that people who are Supreme Court justices cannot tell you what a woman is absurd. So what we are fighting for in the schools is not to push an ideology into those schools, but as you identified, Erika, it's to remove an ideology that has existed in education and has been completely hijacked by the left. So it's been an honor to be in this fight along with so many of you who are in this room. I saw Yvette Benaroch, who was here earlier. I know she was one of those moms that you described who would come to our State Board of Education meetings and would testify about some of the crazy things that she would identify in the schools. So yesterday's Supreme Court decision, sorry, getting back on topic, was about a district where that was not the case. As a result, parents, teachers, students were forced to learn about sexual orientation and gender identity. And so the Supreme Court, with justices appointed by President Trump, held the line and said, that's inappropriate. You cannot force parents, students, and teachers to that indoctrination. And in Florida, we've been doing that for about 3 years now, but it was good to see that the Supreme Court has now paved the way for the nation's parents to have similar protections.
And it's allowing the parents to opt out of this very extreme curriculum on the LGBTQ side. And what was interesting, it was the Muslims and the Christian parents that came together to say, I need to opt out of this curriculum. And they, at first, the school was saying, no, they have to do it. So do you imagine the school making that decision over the parents? I mean, absolutely insane. And of course, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson basically saying, it's an attack on the public education. Very wrong. Let me ask you this, Erika, on the dismantling of the Department of Education. That's something that President Trump has been talking about. Why do we need significant reform in the Department of Education? How bureaucratic is this federal agency?
Wait, let me take a step back because this applies to both. This Mahmoud case of yesterday, where now we're saying parents can opt out of these indoctrinating subjects. I would say that actually proves that parents should also be able to opt out of the government system completely, because it is an indoctrination system writ large in many cases. So if they can opt out of one subject, they need to be able to opt out of the whole thing. We need universal school choice across the nation. Every single family should be able to choose the school that works for their children. Now, why is that important in dismantling the department? The Department of Education is a bureaucracy that exists to uphold the status quo. The money that is pushed down from the federal government, and that's all it is. They don't educate a single child from the federal Department of Education. They're pushing money down from the federal government and using it to control what's going on in the states and in the districts for their ideology historically. But it's a bureaucracy which is just another layer of compliance and staff that we don't need as taxpayers and we don't want to pay for. If we can dismantle that bureaucracy and do what President Trump has said, push it down to the states, but more importantly, incentivize the states to put those funds in the hands of parents and let parents decide how those monies are going to be used to educate their children, whether it means special needs students because a parent wants to say, I want a tutor for my child, or I need this special service. If it's a parent of a low-income student who wants to choose a school outside of their neighborhood that's safer, that aligns with their values, their religious beliefs, and that's going to provide better academically for their student. What we need to do is, in the dismantling of this power from the top, empower the least among us and the most accountability, which comes from parents. So ultimately, that is the goal of getting rid of the department. Not just to say, oh, we got rid of this bureaucracy, but what are we going to do with that power? We disperse it to the parents where it belongs.
On this as well, I want to ask you, Satsi, on the university side, on higher education, we have seen more violent protests happening on college campuses. We just saw the resignation of the University of Virginia president because of pressure from the Department of Justice on these DEI initiatives, because our focus has been on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is happening with higher education? Even for parents are going, I'm sending my kid over to college and then they become a communist? No, thank you.
Not in Florida. In Florida, we have done so much in higher education reform, whether it's the elimination of DEI, the elimination of critical race theory. We have gone through programs to determine return on investment because we want these kids to not leave with debt and not jobs. Under this governor, tuition for in-state students has not increased, and he has committed it will not increase. But just last week, Florida had a major announcement, and it was related to accreditation. I don't know if you've tracked it, but that is a huge imposition to what we've tried to get done here in Florida, because you have accreditors like Sachs who have criteria that say if you want to receive accreditation as a university, you have to have DEI. And so the governor, with 6 other states, has created this consortium so that there's an alternative, a conservative accreditor that says you cannot force ideology on universities. Now, to President Trump's credit, he also issued an executive order that said you cannot, as an accreditor, require a university to violate a law within their state. So in Florida, where you have laws that say you cannot expend taxpayer dollars towards DEI, President Trump's executive order says, okay, Sachs, even though you're woke, in Florida, you're not allowed to be woke because now you cannot impose that ideology on that university. So I am so thankful that we have done, you read the articles, education has been a top priority for Governor DeSantis. And every time there's a new university president that's selected, everybody says it's another DeSantis ally. But that's not the case. What it is, it's somebody who believes in education, not indoctrination. The opposite is true around the country. And in this state, you didn't see on October 7th protests happening at universities. In fact, it was minutes where an encampment tried to get put up at the University of Florida, and 9 students were arrested by state law enforcement, the Florida Highway Patrol. It was the troopers that immediately removed them from there. Forgive me, I know I'm really passionate. I'm a former prosecutor here in Miami, so I feel like I'm giving a closing statement every time I talk. But, you know, this is a big deal because we get parent after parent who's reaching out to us looking for us to be sort of the help in removing government. It's funny. It's not like what you get in New York and California, where folks flock to the government to sort of provide them with the assistance to remain on government. In Florida, the constituents say, we want you to get out of our schools. We want you to get out of our lives. And it's so refreshing to be in government and do what President Trump is doing at the national level. And so that's why I say you see the Florida model really being spread throughout the nation. And it's been extremely rewarding.
Speaking of closing statements, as the future First Lady of Florida, God willing, Erika, are you going to bring forth education as one of your top issues, and what's your vision for that?
Well, you know how passionate I am, and thank you for even talking about this issue here at CPAC Latino and for inviting us, and for all of you, because I know that people in this room have been active on education issues as well over the past several years, and that's why we're able to get so much done. So it's certainly front and center for me to make sure that we continue these great wins and expand them even further for more equitable funding for school choice, bringing in more innovative school options and education options with creating a free market through school choice is doing that. This is 2025, y'all. We should not have schools that all look identical to one another and look identical to what they did 50 years ago. I think we have not even seen the tip of the iceberg when it comes to education innovation. And I believe Florida is going to be the hub for those innovations going forward. But really part of my heart going into a place where I believe I can make a difference are the children like me who have very rough upbringings. You probably heard some of my story. I grew up with a single mom in Tampa and really didn't have a lot of guidance as a teenager and went through a very rough time. And education is what pulled me out of there and changed my entire life trajectory. So I want to make sure that students who are in the Department of Juvenile Justice, in the foster care system, under DCF, that all of them see a pathway to the American dream for themselves, regardless of where they came from. I know education is the key to that, but having great systems in place and accountability for those systems is also part of it.
And Stasi, to you, what is your message to Hispanic students, to Hispanic parents, as education playing this critical role in their lives as they seek their own opportunities?
Yeah, we will continue to push student achievement as a top priority when I get over to the Department of Education. As a result of our efforts, of the governor's efforts in removing ideology from our schools, our progress monitoring results at the statewide level were released just this week. Hispanic students have increased across the board 4 points. You know how many thousands of students that impacts when it comes to English language arts and math? And civics is now at 70% of students are passing the civics exam and the science exam. This is a big deal for our economy. These students who are getting smarter are going to they're going to have jobs after that. And that's the whole point of the education system. As you identified, Erika, it is a true opportunity for the person who has nothing to utilize education to be able to better themselves. And that's what makes this country so great. And that's what makes Florida the #1 in education in the country.
Well, you heard it here, everyone. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Satsi, so much for joining me in this great discussion about education and the impact on our economy. Thank you so much.